So when you talk about a company secretary, first of all, you just need to know is actually one of the officers of a company. So he's actually one of the officers of a company. And basically, the company secretary will basically mostly be involved with being able to oversee the administrative and basically advising the board of directors on the legal requirements, or what are the requirements the company is supposed to comply with regard to maybe the Companies Act. So he basically advises the board. So you can say a company secretary is an officer of the company who basically oversees the administrative activities of the company, and most importantly also advises the board on the legal requirements, or basically the implications of the laws that basically affect the company. For example, he'll actually be able to advise the board on the requirements that the company should actually be able to comply with regards to the Companies Act. Because you realize in a company that these persons are actually serving as directors on the board, they basically don't, they might not actually be having expertise in matters to do with the law. So that's why you find that this particular company secretary will actually be able to come in and be able to basically try to advise them as to what are the requirements the company should actually be able to comply with regards to the Companies Act or any statute that is basically regulating that particular company. So most of the time you'll find that this particular person appointed as a company secretary, they mostly basically prefer someone who is maybe an advocate of the High Court. But of course, you are going to see the other key qualifications that you must actually be able to have before you can be appointed as a company secretary. So we are saying a company secretary is an officer, one of the officers of a company. His main role is basically to oversee the administrative, and most importantly, apart from the administrative activities, also advise the board on the legal requirements with regards to what the company should actually be able to comply with. Most importantly, the Companies Act, because the Companies Act is the one that actually regulates the operations of companies. It's the one that actually regulates the operations of companies. It's the one that actually regulates the operations of companies. So that is who a company secretary is. So an officer of the company who oversees the administrative and advises the board on the legal requirements, or the legal requirements the company should actually be able to comply with while actually carrying out its operations. So another thing you have to note about the company secretary. So the company secretary can be an individual or a corporate body. He can actually be an individual or a corporate body. So the company can decide to have an in-house person who will basically serve as a company secretary. Alternatively, they could engage another firm to give what is known as secretarial services. Because you are going to see among the qualifications for one to be a company secretary is that you must have actually done the CS course with CASNEB up to the final level. So after you attain this particular qualification, basically now you can actually be able to register and become a certified public secretary in Kenya. Of course, you can go ahead and actually open your firm that can provide secretarial services to other companies. It's just the same case, for example, the qualification you are pursuing, for example, it could be CPA. Once you do CPA up to final level, you could actually basically register with ISPAC and maybe start your own firm to be able to basically provide professional services to other companies or other firms. So that's why you are saying it can be an individual. The company could decide that we just want to have an individual in the company, or an in-house individual basically provide the company secretarial services, or basically serve as an officer of the company providing secretarial services. Alternatively, they could decide to outsource that particular function to another company that is actually registered to provide such services. So most important, in that particular corporate body, you'll find that those people providing the secretarial services have basically attained the qualifications required for them to be able to provide secretarial services to other companies, to be able to provide secretarial services to other companies. Then another thing you need to know about the company secretary is that all public companies must have a company secretary. Must have a company secretary. But for private companies, private companies are required to have a company secretary only if are required to have a company secretary only if the paid up capital is 5 million Kenyan shillings and above, is 5 million and above. Is 5 million and above. So public companies, it's mandatory for them to have a company secretary. So they must ensure they have a registered firm that is providing those services to them, or maybe they have appointed an in-house officer who's basically serving as a company secretary. But for private companies, it's not a must unless your paid up capital is actually over 5 million. So basically, when we talk about paid up, people have actually been able to subscribe for that particular private company's share capital. Basically, the registered capital of the company is over 5 million, and it has actually been able to, it has been taken up by the members of that particular private company. So if the paid up capital of the private company is over 5 million, then in such a case, it will be required under the Companies Act or under the statute to have a company secretary. But for public companies, it doesn't matter. So long as you are a public company, and of course, at this particular point, when I talk about a public company, you should be knowing what is actually a public company, what we mean by a public company. Then a private company, we are saying it's not a must unless the paid up capital is actually over 5 million, So public companies are those ones that they have allowed the members of the public to be able to subscribe for their shares. Then this private company, they don't allow for the members of the public to be able to subscribe for the shares. Then another thing you need to know about the company secretary or the company secretary is that sometimes the company can have two of them. So if there are actually two of them, they'll be termed as, so the company can decide they could have two individuals. They could decide they could have two individuals serving as company secretary. In such a case, they'll be termed as being the joint company secretaries of the company, So sometimes it could not be just be one individual serving as a company secretary. The company can decide it appoints two, or maybe more than two. So it depends with how they want their services to be maybe provided by the company secretaries. So they could decide they have more than one person. So in such a case, they'll be termed as the joint company secretaries of the company, Then of course, you can actually you can see that you are saying in a private company, it is not mandatory for the company secretary to be there. So you could be asking yourself, in such a case, who will actually be providing the secretarial services to the company? In such a case, it is actually presumed, in case there is anything that is actually addressed to the company secretary of a private company that doesn't have a company secretary, then in such a case, that particular address will actually basically be presumed it is supposed to be basically be received by the directors of the company. So in a private company, you're saying it's not mandatory for the company secretary to be there. But of course, if there is no company secretary, who will be providing the secretarial services? If there is anything that is addressed to the company secretary of such a private company, then basically you are saying such an address will be presumed. Maybe it is a letter or it's anything they have addressed to the company secretary of a private company. But in such a private company, we don't have a company secretary. In such a case, it is actually presumed it is actually addressed to the directors of the company. It is addressed to the directors of the company or any officer in the company who has actually been given that particular role, maybe to provide such services or maybe to serve as maybe a secretary of the company. So in such a case, it is presumed it is addressed to the directors of the company, or maybe if they have appointed anyone who could actually basically be serving in such a mandate, such a person is the one who will actually take over that particular address that is addressed to the company. So in a private company that doesn't have a company secretary, any address to the company secretary of the company will be presumed it has actually been addressed to the directors of the company, to the directors of the company, So anything addressed to the company will actually be taken up by the directors of the company. So in summary, that's what you need to know about the company secretary, or basically that's just an introduction about a company secretary. So you're saying is an officer of the company who basically provides or basically facilitates the administrative activities of the company. And most importantly, apart from that, he basically advises the board on the legal requirements or the legal implications that are likely to affect the company while it is actually operating. The reason we are saying this, that is the main role, is because those who are serving as directors of the company, they might not actually be having expertise in matters to do with how companies should actually comply with the law when they're actually operating. So there must be an officer in the company who should actually be able to advise them on what they are supposed to conform with regard to the laws of the country, or maybe the laws regulating the operations of the company. So in such a case, they must have a company secretary, and mostly you'll find out that the company secretary will basically be sitting on the board. He'll actually serve as one of the members of the board of directors. So they'll put him as one of the members of the board of directors, such that he can actually always be sitting in the meetings of the board of directors, so such that he can actually be able to advise them on the legal requirements and the administrative activities of the company. Of course, we'll see the other duties, but that is actually the main duty, or basically how you can actually be able to describe what a company secretary actually does in the company. Then you are saying the company secretary can actually be an individual, or it can actually be a corporate body. It can be a company that has actually been registered that basically provides secretarial services. So the company could decide, instead of us having an in-house individual serving as a company secretary, we can actually outsource this particular function to a firm that is already registered to be able to provide the company secretarial services. So in case they need any legal advice, they could just consult that firm. They'll advise them on what they are supposed to actually to do, or any other duties of the company secretary in the company will be provided by the corporate body. It's just like a service of auditing. You can actually basically outsource it to an auditor, an audit firm, to provide such services. So a corporate body could still provide company secretarial services. Then you are saying it can actually just be one individual or two individuals. If there are two individuals, they'll be termed as being the joint company secretaries of the company, the joint company secretaries of the company. Then we are saying all public companies must have a company secretary. So under the law, all public companies must actually have a company secretary. But for private companies, it is not mandatory unless the paid up capital is actually over 5 million. So if they have a paid up capital over 5 million, then in such a case, they'll be required to have a company secretary. They'll be required to have a company secretary. So that's all you need to know about the company secretary. Just an introduction about it. So we can actually now look at what are the qualifications before you can actually become a company secretary of a company, and how is this particular company secretary actually appointed? How is he actually appointed? So you can look at qualifications and appointments. Qualifications and appointments. Qualifications and appointments of the company secretary. Qualifications and appointment of the company secretary. So there's someone asking there, is there a difference between a company secretary and a chief executive officer? Then concerning the last class, can a company have both an MD and a CEO? So, you know, this particular term, managing director and CEO, in most companies, you'll find that instead of this particular person being termed as a managing director, they just call him the chief executive officer. But basically, it could depend on the company's structure. It just depends on the company structure, but mostly you'll find that instead of them naming him as the MD, they'll just call him the Chief Executive Officer. Most companies that have an MD, you won't find this position. Those ones that don't have this particular position, you'll find they have a Chief Executive Officer. So it's just like one and the same person. He's the top officer in the company just before, because you'll find that mostly it is normally like this. We have the board of directors. Company structures are mostly structures like this. Then down here, you'll find an MD or a chief executive officer. Then down here, you'll find now the line managers. You'll find the finance manager, you'll find the human resource manager, you'll find the sales and marketing manager, you'll find other functions of the company. So this person here basically acts like just a link between these particular functions and the board. But this particular person will actually sit on the board of directors. So he'll actually be one of the directors of the company. For example, if you look at the structure of Safaricom, you'll find that, for example, maybe you can use an example of the current, is he the chief executive officer or MD? Is basically the link between the board and the functions of Safaricom as a company. So you'll find that he actually is a chief executive officer and he actually also sits on the board. So try just to find out what is the board of directors of Safaricom composed of. You'll find that the chief executive officer sits on the board of directors. So mostly you'll find that the MD or the chief executive officer actually sits on the board of directors. He's actually one of the directors of the company. He's one of the directors of the company. He's one of the board members. He's one of the board members. So where you basically have an MD, you'll find that you don't have the chief executive officer. Because sometimes these companies call him the chief executive officer or others call him the MD. They just call him the managing director or the chief executive officer. So you'll find that where we have an MD, this position is not there because it's like one and the same person. If they don't call him the MD, they'll call him the chief executive officer. Chief executive officer. Then there was someone asking, is there a difference between a company secretary and a CEO? There's a difference. There's a difference. A company secretary is not a chief executive officer. Mostly, these particular persons are usually the face of the company. You'll mostly see them as those ones who are actually in the forefront. They are the face of the company. If you look at, for example, KCB, the MD, Joshua Igara, is the face of the company. But of course, there are senior persons who sit on the board. You don't know about them. Even you might not really be knowing more about the company secretary of Kenya Commercial Bank. But the MD is usually the face of the company. For example, right now, Safaricom, you'll mostly know about the MD or the CEO of Safaricom. So they are usually the face of the company. But the company secretary just sits on the board. He just basically advises them. Even right now, if I ask you, who is the company secretary of Safaricom, you might not actually really be knowing. But of course, he's actually one of the senior officers of the company who sits on the board. But mostly these ones are usually the face of the company. You'll know more about them because they basically represent the company as the face of the company. If it's media briefings, you'll see them there. But of course, even the chairman of Safaricom of the board, you don't really know more about him. You'll mostly know more about the MD or the chief executive officer. So there's a difference between a CEO and a company secretary. It's not the same person. It's not the same person. Even when we look at the qualifications of a company secretary, you'll find that mostly those qualifications you see the chief executive officers being appointed, those qualifications of the chief executive officers are not even near to those of the company secretary. So they are quite different because mostly companies will appoint a company secretary because I'm telling you this particular officer, he mostly advises the board. So mostly you'll find out that he's maybe an advocate of the High Court. He has done CA's exam with cast them up to final level. So most companies will look for a lawyer to be able to provide these particular services because he'll actually be able to advise them on the legal matters and he'll actually sit on the board. So if you check the board of directors of most companies, the company secretary actually sits on the board of directors because that is where his main role will actually be played in the company, advising the board on the legal requirements in terms of the operations of the company. For example, if you look at a company like Safaricom, you find that they have to conform with laws that are actually basically regarding telecommunications. So there's a telecommunication law that is actually regulating Safaricom as a company. There's the Companies Act itself. So many laws could actually be regulating the company. But of course, this person sitting on the board, even the chief executive officer, he doesn't have expertise in law. You find that maybe he has done a degree in telecommunications, he has a degree in management, he has a degree in Bachelor of Commerce, he's an accountant, he's a finance manager, but matters to do with law, he doesn't actually really understand very well. So that's why the company secretary has to come in. So that's why he's actually one of the key officers. He's a very important officer of the company, and he's actually a very senior officer. He's a very senior officer. So when you talk about a company secretary in a company, don't presume that is the normal secretary you see maybe providing services as a junior officer. We are talking about that particular senior company secretary who basically now advises the board, and they're usually paid a hefty salary. They are paid a hefty salary. So another thing you need to know that this particular person, a company secretary, previously in the ancient times, he was just seen like a mere officer or a puppet of the board. But nowadays, this particular person known as a company secretary has a lot of powers. Even if you look at the company secretary, he has actually been, the Companies Act, he has been given a lot of powers and duties in the company. So he's actually a very senior officer of the company secretary. That's why we even learn more about him here in company law. So the CEO and the company secretary are actually very different. If a company doesn't have an MD, they'll basically opt to call this particular person CEO. So in certain places, the CEO is just known as an MD. In certain places, the MD is just known as a CEO. So they serve as almost the same function. So rarely you will find in a company, we have an MD, then we have a CEO. If you have a CEO, this particular position won't be there. If you have an MD, this particular position won't actually be there. So they serve one and the same role. So they are just the link between the functions of the company and basically the board of directors. Because I told you this particular person will basically implement the strategies of the board in the company and basically try to report back to the board on how far these particular matters are actually being implemented in the company. So that's why you are saying he has to sit on the board of directors. So if these ones are just coming up with strategies on how the company should actually be able to prosper for the benefit of the shareholders. Now they send this particular person to the company to basically link with the finance manager, HR, these particular functions in the company to be able to implement the strategies of the board in the company. So that's why you see most company structures are structured like this. At the top, there's the board of directors. Then there's a link in between. There's usually a link in between and the functions of the company. So basically down here, you'll see there's the function of the finance manager. There's the human resource manager. There's the sales and marketing manager. You can have a production manager. So they basically report to the MD. The MD reports to the board of directors, So I hope I've been able to answer. So Teresa is asking, a company secretary is like a company lawyer. We could actually call him like a lawyer, but basically not really a lawyer, because we should actually just say he's an officer of the company. You know, mostly if you need the services of a lawyer, you basically outsource them from a law firm. But now he can't actually be able to represent the company, for example, in a court of law. That's why we can't call him a lawyer. We call him an officer. He's appointed by the company like on, we would say like on a full-time basis. He's paid a salary each and every month. So mostly he can't represent the company in a court of law. So we can just call him, the way I've told you as I started, he's an officer of the company. He's like just like an officer, like the finance manager. So he's been appointed to provide a role or to play a role in the company. So that's why we call him an officer of the company. If the company needs services of a lawyer, they could actually basically maybe seek from a law firm. So qualifications and appointment of a company secretary. So the most key thing to be able to know first about appointment is to know that the company secretary in a company will be appointed by the board of directors. So the board of directors are the ones who have that particular mandate or role of actually appointing a company secretary in a company. So they'll appoint a company secretary and actually set what will be his remuneration and what will be among his key roles and duties in the company. So the board of directors appoints, sets remuneration, and outlines the role of the company secretary in the company, secretary in the company. So he'll be appointed by the board of directors. So of course, before they actually appoint him, they'll basically have to ascertain that he has the requisite knowledge and experience to be able to perform in such an office. So before they appoint, they have to ascertain before appointment, the board of directors will ascertain, whether this particular person has the requisite knowledge, has requisite or required knowledge, has the requisite knowledge, has the requisite knowledge and experience, to serve, in such an office, So they'll ascertain whether he has experience, he has maybe served as a company secretary elsewhere, he has been serving maybe as a company secretary for another firm for this particular number of years. Does he have the knowledge? Then also they'll likely be able to ascertain whether he's a holder of a practicing certificate. This was actually also very important. He is a holder of a practicing certificate, from the Institute of Certified Public Secretaries of Kenya. So they'll ascertain whether he has the requisite knowledge and experience. He has actually served as a company secretary maybe elsewhere. Then number two, another key qualification, or before they appoint him, they'll basically ascertain whether he is a holder of a practicing certificate from the Institute of Certified Public Secretaries of Kenya. So this is basically the institute that basically now gives company secretaries a practicing certificate. It's just like the same case. After you've done with your CPA up to final level, you'll basically have to get a practicing certificate from the Institute of Certified Public Accountants of Kenya. So of course, for company secretaries also, they have their own body that actually registers them. For example, in the case of lawyers, before you start practicing as a lawyer, then you've gotten you've actually been admitted to serve in the bar as an advocate of the High Court. You are a member of the Law Society of Kenya. So for the same case for company secretaries, they also have to be members of the Institute of Certified Public Secretaries of Kenya, and they have actually been issued with a practicing certificate to be able to provide company secretarial services, or maybe to serve as company secretaries in a company. So the case of also accountants, we'll see that one in the next topic. The next topic on about auditors is that you must have actually attained or basically been given a practicing certificate from the Institute of Certified Public Accountants of Kenya. So just the same case with company secretaries, also they have their own body that gives them a practicing certificate. So of course you are saying these are the major things that the company will actually be able to look at. But you can actually see here, I'm saying you have to have actually been given a practicing certificate from the Institute of Certified Public Secretaries of Kenya. So how will this particular institute be able to give you a practicing certificate? How will they actually be able to give you a practicing certificate? So we can look at qualifications to attain a practicing certificate from the Institute of Certified. So they look at certain qualifications. For example, the most key one, that you've done the CS exam up to final level. You've done the CS exam up to final level. You've done the CS exam up to final level. So under the Public Secretaries Act, under the Public Secretaries Act, the law regulating provision of services of company secretaries, one is registered to practice as a company secretary, if he has the following qualifications. These are the qualifications they can actually be able to look at, and basically ascertain that you have the knowledge to be able to start practicing as a company secretary. Now you can now basically be appointed as a company secretary in any company and basically provide company secretarial services. So basically that particular act that basically states what are the qualifications before you can actually be registered with the Institute of Certified Public Secretaries of Kenya, because that particular institute is basically, it comes into existence through this particular law or act. It's just the same case with the accountants. The Institute of Certified Public Accountants of Kenya was actually brought into existence by what is known as the Accountants Act, by the Accountants Act. So these ones also, they have their own law that basically regulates how they're actually supposed to serve as company secretary. So this particular law basically has set up the Institute of Certified Public Secretaries of Kenya. And of course, under this particular act, the qualifications that one must have actually ascertained before you can actually be registered is that they can actually look at, number one, you can talk about having attained a certificate, indicated CS final exam by CASNEB. So if you finish your CPA, or you could decide also to do this one, such that you can actually maybe provide company secretarials to other companies, or maybe set up your own firm to start providing company secretarial services. So that's why you find mostly that if you have anyone who has an audit firm, he'll actually basically also pursue this particular qualification before he can basically start providing company secretarial services to other companies. So this one is actually a key qualification that they can actually be able to look at and basically give you a practicing certificate. Then they can actually look at, previously they could actually look at as a citizen of Kenya and a member of a professional body known as the Institute of Chartered Secretaries and Administrators. So a citizen of Kenya who is a member, who is a member of the Institute of Chartered Secretaries, who is a member of institutes, who is a member of Institute of Chartered, who is a member of the Institute of Chartered Secretaries and administrators, This one is CISA. Then another qualification that they could actually be able to look at is that you're an advocate of the High Court. You can talk about if you are an advocate of the High Court, 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 an advocate of the High Court. If you are an advocate of the High Court, an advocate of the High Court, then maybe you can talk about any other relevant qualification, They could look at these particular 3 key qualifications and any other relevant qualification that they feel that can actually be able to maybe enable you provide company secretarial services. For example, if you pursue this particular qualification, then you basically learn more about provision of company secretarial services to other companies. So there are several units that you'll likely be able to learn For example, you learn about strategic management. So you can actually be able now, after you've attained this particular qualification, be able to advise the board of directors of a company. That's why it's exactly seen as a major qualification before you can actually now be given a practicing certificate by the Institute of Certified Public Secretaries of Kenya. So if you are a member of this particular body known as CISA, then also they could actually basically give you that particular practicing certificate. If you are an advocate of the High Court and basically you may be served as maybe a company secretary elsewhere, you have the experience, they could actually give you a practicing certificate, or they could actually look at any other relevant qualification that they feel that you can actually enable you to provide company secretarial services. So long as maybe you can give them your qualification, you basically give them the qualifications, maybe what you've actually pursued, they look at it, they ascertain that it's actually relevant, then they can actually give you a practicing certificate. But most you'll find that most people actually maybe want to provide company secretarial services. They basically pursue this particular qualification from CASNEP. So from CASNEP, then they'll actually be able to provide company secretarial services. Sometimes you'll find that there actually may be lawyers who have actually been admitted to the bar, so they are serving as advocates. So they basically now maybe come in and actually maybe further their knowledge by pursuing this particular qualification, and they could actually maybe be given a practicing certificate to be able to provide company secretarial services, So the key thing is just for you to be able to know that a company secretary in a company will actually be appointed by the board of directors. They'll set what will be his remuneration. Then of course, they'll actually also ascertain what will be his key roles or roles in the company when he's actually serving as a company secretary. Before they do that, of course, they have to look at whether he has the knowledge or experience to be able to serve in such a position. Then, of course, he has a practicing certificate, which is actually very key, a practicing certificate from the Institute of Certified Public Secretaries of Kenya. How do you get this particular certificate or practicing certificate? So this particular body will actually, you have basically to provide evidence that you can actually be able to provide secretarial services by maybe providing your papers or qualifications. They look at them and basically now they can give you a practicing certificate. Part of the qualifications that's actually very key before they give you that particular practicing certificate is, of course, you are saying you actually have pursued the CS exam up to final level. So that is a qualification they could just look at and just give you that particular practicing certificate. Or if you are a citizen of Kenya, now you're actually a member of the Institute of Chartered Secretaries and Administrators, then of course they could actually give you a practicing certificate to serve as a company secretary. If you have an advocate of the High Court and maybe you have the experience of serving as a company secretary, they could actually also give you the practicing certificate, or they could look at any other relevant qualification. So if they ascertain that that particular qualification has given you the knowledge to be able to provide secretarial services to a company, they could actually give you a practicing certificate. So that's how basically company secretary will actually be appointed, and those are some of the part of qualifications that can actually enable one to be able to provide company secretarial services, So just remember that, for example, in the case of, I've told you it can be an individual or a corporate body. So that particular corporate body, you'll find that those people providing those particular services from the corporate body have basically been given a practicing certificate from the Institute of Certified Public Secretaries of Kenya. So you can register your firm, then the institute actually approves the firm to provide the secretarial services. But of course, in that particular firm, there must be a person, like for example, the manager or the top guy or the partner should have actually been approved to provide the secretarial services. So before the firm can actually be approved also to provide company secretarial services, So I can see Eunice saying there, secretary takes minutes, company secretary takes minutes, italics. So that is actually very true. You'll see that as one of the key duties of a company secretary. In any meeting, he'll actually be able to take minutes. He takes actually minutes. So that is one of the key roles. But of course, that one you'll see it under the duties of a company secretary, the duties of a company secretary, the duties of a company secretary. So we've seen how he is actually appointed or what are his qualifications, but sometimes the company secretary can be disqualified from office. So how will he be disqualified from office? What will be part of the reasons that can actually make the company secretary be disqualified. So disqualification from office. Disqualification from office. Disqualification from office. So sometimes they can actually be disqualified. Basically, it means that the board sees that now this person is not the best person who can actually continue to serve as a company secretary. So part of the reasons that can actually make a company secretary be disqualified from office is, for example, if it is ascertained, so reasons for disqualifications, it could be if it is ascertained, he is of unsound mind. He is of unsound mind. You can say if it is ascertained by a qualified medical practitioner, a qualified medical practitioner, if it is ascertained by a qualified medical practitioner, he is of unsound mind. So that could actually be one of the reasons that could actually make a company secretary be disqualified from office. Another one is if he is undischarged, or declared to be bankrupt, So if he is undischarged, discharged or declared to be bankrupt, is undischarged, bankrupt, or declared to be bankrupt by a court of law, basically means that maybe a receiver has actually been appointed to maybe oversee his assets and maybe pay off his liabilities. So the company could actually release him from actually serving as the company secretary until when he has actually sorted the matter. If he's convicted by a court of law, if convicted by a court of law, for having been involved in fraud or dishonesty, Then the last one, if his certificate of practice, is maybe revoked, if his certificate of practice is revoked, or cancelled, or you can say cancelled, by the Institute of Certified Public Secretaries of Kenya. So you no longer have that particular practicing certificate. So they could look at you are not actually following the rules and regulations put in place by the institute. In such a case, they could revoke your practicing certificate. So in such a case, you are not allowed to continue to serve as a company secretary. So you could actually lose your position, or you could actually be disqualified from office. 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 Then we can look at the duties. So what are the duties of the company secretary? So you are saying in the ancient times or long time ago, this particular person known as a company secretary was just seen like a puppet of the board of directors, because the board of directors could actually appoint him to basically and actually give him what would be his roles. So he was just like a puppet of the board. But most recently, the company secretary has actually been given a lot of powers, mostly under the statute or under the Companies Act. So he's actually one of the senior officers of the company. So it's not like in the ancient times or maybe long time ago, basically where he was just seen like a puppet of the board, or basically the board could actually maybe direct him or her to maybe do certain roles in the company. So in such a case, you are saying in the recent times, or most recently, the company secretary has a lot of duties and powers in the company that have actually been given by the statutes. So we can have different duties and powers. So you have duties and powers of the company secretary. Eunice has given one of the duties there to take minutes at the meetings of the company. It could be a board of directors meeting, it could be a general meeting. So he's the one who has that particular mandate to be able to take the minutes. So the duties and powers of the company secretary. Powers of the company secretary. Duties and powers of the company secretary. Duties and powers of the company secretary. So the first one, which is actually very key under the statute, is to update the registers, of the company. So we've seen there are different registers in the company. For example, register of members, register of debenture holders. You're just going to see another one, register of the company secretary, register of the company secretary, register of the company secretary. So to update the registers of the company and ensure they're in good order, and ensure they are, and ensure they are in good order. They are in good order. And available for inspection, and available for inspection, and available for inspection. So that is one of the duties of the company secretary. Then to ensure all the necessary forms of the registrar are accurate and submitted on time, ensuring all necessary forms of for the registrar are accurate and submitted on time. So any submission the company has to make, maybe to the registrar. So there are several submissions the company is supposed to make. For example, registration of charges. So those forms that are being filled to seek for registration of charges, they must actually be filled properly. So he's the one who will actually ensure that they are properly filled and they're actually submitted in time. Because most of these particular submissions to the registrar, you basically realize that they have a timeline or they have a deadline. For example, registering or basically informing the registrar with regard to the allotment of shares of the company, it must be done within a period of 14 days. So within a period of 14 days, then it basically means that he has to basically submit the correct forms that are basically registering the allotment of the shares of the company. So all submissions to the registrar must actually be made properly, and the forms seeking for the submissions should actually be properly filled by the company secretary. Another one is to ensure custody, safe custody of the company's sale. To ensure safe custody of the company's sale. To ensure safe custody of the company sale. To ensure safe custody of the company sale. To ensure safe custody of the company sale. Safe custody of the company sale. You can say safe custody and correct use. So safe custody and correct use of the company sale. Safe custody and correct use of the company sale. To ensure safe custody and correct use of the company sale. The company sale is like basically like a stamp. I think you know a sale. I don't know if you guys have seen it. It's not like the normal stamp you use, but this one is actually very special. You just press and it will actually basically appear on a document of the company. So sometimes you could just press it, or maybe you could just view through the document and you'll actually be able to see it. So that particular sale being used by the company, you should actually be able to ensure that it is actually kept safely. It's basically what is actually basically used to authenticate the documents of the company. Any document originating from the company will basically be sealed by the company seal. So instead of having stamps, certain companies prefer to have the one that is recognized under the law is actually the company seal, but most companies just use the stamp. So that stamp serves the same purpose like a company seal, Then another one is to take minutes at the meetings of the company. That one you've already been told there by Eunice. Take minutes at the meetings of the company, Take minutes at the meetings of the company. For example, if we have a general meeting of the members, the company secretary will likely be there to ensure that minutes are actually taken. If you have a board of directors meeting, because that's what you are saying, she actually sits or he actually sits on the board of directors. In case of a board of directors meeting, he'll likely also be there to take the minutes of the proceedings of the company. Then another one is to ensure the company complies. With the Companies Act. To ensure the company complies with the Companies Act. And other legislations. When you talk about other legislations, there might be any other law that is regulating the company apart from the Companies Act. For example, in the case of like telecommunication industry, there's the Telecommunication Act. So that is the legislation regulating companies operating in the telecommunication industry. So it basically advise the company on matters to do with the Companies Act, and of course also matters to do with legislation affecting the company in its operations. So to ensure the company complies with the Companies Act and any other relevant legislation Then if it is a public company, to ensure it complies with the requirements of the Securities Exchange. So in case of a public company, ensure it complies with the requirements of the Securities Exchange, complies with requirements of the Securities Exchange, complies with requirements of the Securities Exchange. If it is a public company, because public companies are usually listed on the stock exchange, so it basically advise them on the requirements for them to be listed and how are they actually supposed to comply. Complies with requirements of the Securities Exchange. Requirements of the Securities Exchange. When you talk about Securities Exchange in Kenya, basically just mean the Nairobi Securities Exchange. So that's where companies in Kenya, or public companies in Kenya, are actually listed. Then to ensure changes to the register of members are properly handled. To ensure changes to the register of members are properly handled and correct. Share certificates are issued and correct. Share certificates are issued. So under the topic of membership, you learn more about change in membership, how one becomes a member. Under the topic of transfer of shares, you learn more about transfer of shares and what actually happens. They normally issue a new share certificate. So all those matters will basically be approved by the board, but the one who will basically effect and actually sign will basically be the company secretary. So it basically ensures the register of members is actually basically handled properly. Any changes made, they're actually handled properly. In case there's a person buying shares becoming a member, his name is included, and that particular person has gotten the share certificate. The one who was a member and is actually leaving, his certificate has actually been revoked or cancelled. So it ensures all those particular matters are actually properly handled in the company, properly handled in the company. Another one is to send out notices of meetings, notices of the company to the members, to send out notices of the company to the members. For example, if there's a notice of a meeting in a company, is the one who will basically send out the notice, maybe through the mail, or basically you'll find that, for example, if there's an advertisement, he's the one who has actually been able to sign that particular notice as the company secretary and maybe one of the directors of the company. So he'll basically send out notices of the company out to the members of the company. Then to send out copies, to send out copies of the financial statements, copies of the financial statements, to send out copies of the financial statements to the members of the company, members of the company, to send out copies of the financial statements to the members of the company. Maybe after the approval at the annual general meeting, so each and every member has a right to get a copy. So he's the one who will actually basically send out those particular copies, to the members of the company, those particular copies to the members of the company. Then there's another one which is actually very key, to ensure the annual return to the register of companies is accurate and submitted on time. To ensure the annual return to the register of companies is accurate and submitted on time. To ensure the annual return to the register of companies is accurate and submitted on time. To ensure the annual return to the registrar of companies, is accurate and submitted on time, So there's a return that companies normally make to the register of companies. So of course, you guys could actually just be knowing about a return to the Kenya Revenue Authority. But of course, each and every year after you've registered as a company, you're supposed to make a return to the register of companies each and every year. So that place you seek to be registered as a company, you must make a return to that particular place at the registrar's office. So that return you actually make is usually prepared by a company secretary. So for example, if you you have a private company and you want it to be submitted, then of course it has to be stamped by a company secretary before it can actually be accepted by the registrar of companies. So it is the company secretary who will actually basically ensure that this particular return has actually been made each and every year in the life of the company. So you could be asking, what will be the content of this particular return? We'll learn more about it in our next topic about, I think it's topic 10, I think 10 or 11. It's about accounts and the returns that are made by companies. But just know that in this particular return, you know, for example, when you registered your company, maybe you're actually maybe 3 directors, but one of them has actually exited. So it's just a return that basically contains an update of basically the proceedings in the company in terms of maybe membership. Maybe when you started, you were actually 10 members in the company, but of course things have actually changed. Maybe when you registered the company, your registered office was maybe in Westlands, but right now it is actually in town. So you have to make that particular update to the register of companies. So each and every year, you must make that particular return to the register of companies. So the person who actually makes that return and fills out the forms to be able to make that particular return will be the company secretary. So to ensure that annual return to the register of companies is actually correct and actually is actually submitted on time. So each and every company must make a return to the registrar of companies. So apart from the returns to KRA, there are usually other returns that are supposed to be made to the registrar of companies. So these returns are normally made by the company secretary, So that is one of the key roles that he actually plays in the company. So that annual return to the registrar is actually submitted correctly and actually on time. So those are among the key duties of the company secretary. The key duties of the company secretary. Those are among the key duties of the company secretary. So I can see Galaxy J7 is actually asking, must a company secretary be an advocate of the High Court? So we are saying it is not actually a must. Basically, what the institute basically looks at is, do you have the relevant qualifications such that you can actually be appointed as a company secretary? So, of course, you have said the qualifications they could look at maybe if you are an advocate of the High Court, because in such a case, you've learned matters to do with the law, so you can advise the board. But of course, still, if you pursue a qualification known as CS with CASNEB, the knowledge you get, that particular knowledge you get after you get the final certificate can actually enable you to provide company secretarial services. So they'll register you. It's just like the same way, for example, when you talk about you having done maybe CPA up to final level. So they'll automatically register you to serve as an accountant, because these things you are learning, you've done FR, you've done accounting. So they know that this person, he has gone through the system and he basically can actually be able to provide accounting services. So if you do the CS exam up to final level, you'll basically have acquired the right knowledge to basically serve as a company secretary. So you'll still be given a certificate. The same case if you do, you are an advocate of the High Court, and of course you have the relevant experience, they could still actually go ahead and actually give you a certificate to practice as a company secretary, But the most key qualification is CS exam up to final level. That's why you find that even if you have an advocate, you still basically want to pursue CS exam, because the knowledge he got maybe by studying just law generally is not the same knowledge he'll get when he does the CS exam up to final level. So the papers there in CS, they might actually be missing in his maybe qualifications to become an advocate of the High Court. So those qualifications you get, or that knowledge you get after doing the CS up to final level, is actually quite enough knowledge to enable you to provide company secretarial services. So that's why they'll give you a certificate to continue to practice as a company secretary. But of course, we are saying being an advocate of the High Court could actually be very advantageous, especially for big corporate companies, because these particular big corporate companies, there are several laws that actually regulate them. For example, when you talk about Safaricom, it is not only the Companies Act that actually regulates Safaricom. We have the Telecommunications Act that actually also regulates Safaricom. We have other laws. So that's why such big corporate companies could actually basically seek for the services from maybe an advocate of the High Court or someone who has studied law, and maybe he has all these qualifications that are required, so such that they can actually appoint him as a company secretary. But of course, how many big corporate companies do we have? They are just maybe like a few, they are not really many. So the small companies that are not big corporate companies are the ones that maybe could actually be seeking for company secretarial services. So that's why you find that most people who actually serve as company secretaries have just basically attained the qualification of CS exam up to final level. So you'll be given a certificate to practice as a company secretary. So you'll find that most people who do CPA exam up to final level, once they get the certificate to practice as auditors or maybe as accountants, they likely also pursue the CS exam such that they can provide the two services. So they can provide for the same client, maybe they could decide that they can actually be able to provide the secretarial services to that client and also be as the auditors of the same client. So in such a case, it could be an advantageous for such a firm, because it could actually maybe onboard several clients as a result of actually being able to provide secretarial services. So most accountants, once they register their own firms, they basically also pursue the CS exam up to final level, because several companies, like small private companies, will likely be seeking for secretarial services. For example, this return I'm talking about, you must make it annually to the register of companies. You know, if you are a small private company, you can't do it alone. You'll basically have to go to look for that stamp. And that stamp can actually only be gotten from a person who has been registered to provide secretarial services. In such a case, you find that most auditing firms, they'll basically also provide secretarial services. They provide secretarial services. Even if you are to do transfer of shares in a private company, before the register basically, for example, you registered a company as 10 members, a small private company. But now one of them wants to exit. He doesn't want to be a member of the company. So you have to transfer the shares to the other members who might have actually acquired them. In such a case, before the registrar actually approved that particular transfer, basically that transfer must be made by a company secretary. So that's why you can see we are talking about he ensures maybe changes are made to the register of members, and maybe there is actually proper issue of share certificates. So a company secretary is the one who can actually basically facilitate your transfer of shares in a private company, because this particular submission will be made to the register of companies. If that particular stamp from this particular company secretary is actually missing, then the transfer won't actually happen. You can't do it alone. So you have to seek for the service. So it is one of the essential services that is normally most companies actually need. So most companies actually need. That's why we are saying a company secretary is actually a very key officer in a company. Is actually a very key officer in a company. So those are actually the duties. So we still just have like, this is actually one of the shortest topics we are going to finish today. So we can look at the legal position of the company secretary, and then look at the register of company secretaries. Then of course we can look at a few past paper questions here. But of course this particular area of the duties, be keen with it. This particular area the examiner actually likes to test. I don't know why he likes duties, I don't know. He likes testing on duties of the company secretary. So if you do an analysis of the past paper, you find that it has actually been tested almost 6 times. So it's something you can't actually afford to forget. So the duties of a company secretary is actually very, very key. And in fact, we'll see in the past papers how they have actually been able to test on the duties of the company secretary. So I want us to look at the legal position of the company secretary. The legal position of the company secretary. So under the law, basically when we talk about the legal position, under the law, how can the company secretary actually be viewed in the company? How can he be viewed in the company? The legal position of the company secretary. The legal position of the company secretary. The legal position of the company secretary. So the company secretary can actually be viewed. The company secretary can actually be viewed. So I can see Catherine is actually asking, does the company secretary have powers? Oh, these particular duties you are talking about, we can see some of them, we can just see them as powers, because, you know, for example, when I'm telling you, you can't, in a company, you can't actually transfer your shares without seeking the services of a company secretary. So that is a power that he has. You have to look for that particular company secretary. So those duties could just also be categorized as powers of the company secretary. So like services like provision of transfer of shares, or being able to transfer shares, doing a return to the registrar. You can't do it without the company secretary. So that is something that has actually been empowered to be able to do. So once you get that particular certificate, then of course you have the power to be able to provide those particular services, those powers to be able to provide those particular services. So they can't be done with anyone else in the company apart from the company secretary. Even the director can't do it. You can't actually transfer the shares in the company. So those duties could just also be categorized as part of the powers of the company secretary that have actually been given by the statute. These duties you are talking about, if you look at the Companies Act, they are there. So they are actually in the law. It's not something that is done by the company secretary just from anywhere. There's a law in place. For example, the Companies Act basically gives them these particular duties and powers. So they say that the company secretary, these are actually his roles. He's the one who actually supposed to approve transfer of shares, to basically update the registers of the company. So not any other officer in the company can actually be able to do such functions. So you can just categorize these duties as part of the powers that have actually been given by the statute or the Companies Act. Because these duties you are talking about, they are actually in the law. There's a law in place that basically empowers them to be able to provide these particular duties. So even the board is not the one that gives them these particular powers or duties. These duties are actually basically under the Companies Act. If you look at the Companies Act, they basically state that in a company will have a company secretary, and these will be his duties and powers or his roles that he's actually supposed to play. So they are not even given by the board, but of course the board is the one that actually appoint him. But among the duties that the board will give the company secretary, most obviously they'll just derive them from the Companies Act. So those particular duties are already outlined by a law in place. So that's what you are saying is actually a very key officer of the company. So those duties can also just be seen as the powers of the company secretary, as the powers of the company secretary. So I can see Eunice saying, what if the secretary fails to maintain the registers? Will he or she be liable? Of course, she'll actually be held liable, because several things could actually arise out of a register. Someone could actually go to a court of law and actually claim that I've not actually been included as one of the members of the company. In such a case, if the court actually tries to look for who is actually liable in the company, then of course it will be the company secretary, because we are saying any changes in the register of members will actually be approved by the board of directors. Once the board of directors has done it, then of course it is the company secretary to effect the changes. So the company secretary will actually effect the changes. So for example, the board approved it, but this particular person fails to basically make the changes. So the company secretary will likely be held liable, for such an offense. Failure to basically update or include the name of a person in a register of members. What maybe I need to ascertain is maybe is there a fine or a penalty that will be given? That one I have to ascertain, but that will likely be an offense that he will have actually committed, because if the board has approved changes in the register of members, then of course the company secretary has to effect the changes. So failure to do so, then I can see Alex is asking, in the case of a private company with no 5 million and above, who does the filing of returns to the registrar? Who does the filing of the returns to the registrar? So what will actually happen, for example, if you have your private company and you want to make your returns to the register of companies, what you will do, you'll basically seek for the services of a registered body of company secretaries. But of course, you are saying, for example, if you have a company or a private company that has a paid up capital of more than 5 million, then in such a case, it is mandatory to indicate you have an officer that basically provides company secretarial services. He sits in the company's premises, or is actually an officer you have actually employed on a full-time basis, or basically you could actually also indicate you have a corporate body that you've actually appointed officially to be able to provide the company secretarial services. But if your paid up capital is actually less than 5 million, then you don't have to appoint an officer to be sitting in the premises of the company as a company secretary. Or you must, it is not a must for you to be able to have a full-time corporate body that provides company secretarial services. In such a case, for example, when it reaches the time for you to make the return, you just outsource that particular function for that particular filing. So you basically seek for that particular company secretary to assist you to make the returns. Because I'm telling you, when you'll be making the return, it is a must. There must be the stamp for the company secretary. If it is not there, the registrar won't actually accept the returns. So in this case, if your company doesn't have a paid up capital of over 5 million, what most people normally do, they look for a firm that is registered. Then they tell them, this year I'm going to do a return. So they charge them, like, for example, 5,000. So he charges you 5,000. He tells you, I do the return for you. So in such a case, you're only seeking for that particular service when you really need it. You don't have to engage that particular corporate body on a full-time basis to serve as a company secretary. Maybe you pay monthly. So when you need to do the return, that's when you likely be seek for that particular service. So you go to the company secretary, he basically prepares the forms for you, fills out for you, then he basically submits on your behalf to the register of companies. Alternatively, he could actually basically maybe stamp it for you and just deliver it by yourself. So that is what you'll actually do. So if you have a small private company and you want to do the return, for example, you are the sole director, you've registered your own company, that return is actually mandatory, because if you fail to do it, there's usually a penalty. I think it's 1,500 per annum If you fail to file each and every year, they'll charge you a penalty. So you'll be doing the return. If the registrar discovers that for the previous years you've not made the return, they'll tell you to pay a penalty for the previous years, 1,500 times the number of years. So annually, when you are seeking for making that return, you'll basically look for a company secretary. He'll basically prepare the return for you and basically now submit it to the registrar. That's why you are saying company secretarial services are actually very essential, and most companies will actually be seeking for these services. Will be seeking for these services. So we can look at the legal position of the company secretary. So the company secretary can actually be viewed under the law in 3 ways. So the company secretary can be viewed under the law in 3 ways. So the company secretary can actually be viewed under the law in 3 ways. So you can be viewed as, we normally say, as a servant of the company, as a servant of the company. Number 2, you can be viewed as an agent of the company, agent of the company. Then number 3, as an officer of the company, officer of the company. So you can be viewed under the law in 3 ways: as a servant of the company, as an agent of the company, as an officer of the company. When you talk about being a servant of the company, we basically mean that, for example, you've seen is a servant. You've seen that it is the board of directors that will actually appoint the company secretary. So in this scenario, when we look at how he's actually appointed, we could just say he's like a servant of the board of directors, because they're the ones who basically appoint him and set his remuneration and set some of his roles. So one of the ways he can actually be viewed in the company is by him actually being a servant of the company. So a servant of is a servant of the company whose duty is to act in accordance with the instructions given to him by directors. So that's how basically you can actually describe him actually being a servant of the company. So he's appointed by the board of directors, and he likely act according to the instructions of the board of directors. So some of the roles will likely be set by the board of directors. But of course, you are saying generally the duties and the duties of this particular company secretary are already outlined in the Companies Act. And I've told you, mostly in the ancient times or long time ago, he was just seen as a puppet of the board of directors, because they're the ones who actually appointed him and set out his roles. But recently, there are laws in place. For example, the Companies Act gives the company secretary a lot of duties to be able to perform as an officer of the company. So we can actually see him as a servant of the company in this sense, that he's actually appointed by the board of directors, and they basically set his remuneration and instruct him on how he's actually supposed to perform his or her duties. So that's how basically you can actually describe him as a servant of the company. So he's a servant of the company whose duty is to act in accordance with the instructions given to him by the directors of the company, whose duties will actually be, he'll actually act according to the instructions of the board of directors, or instructions given to him by the directors of the company, directors of the company. Then how do we see him as an agent of the company? So an agent is basically someone who's actually performing a task on your behalf. So he's actually seen as an agent of the company, because you've seen sometimes he could actually be involved in administrative activities of the company. So he can actually basically maybe enter into certain contracts on behalf of the company. For example, he could hire furniture in the company. He could hire maybe stationery in the company while he's carrying out administrative activities given by the board of directors. So if the board of directors has given him certain administrative activities in the company, basically it means that he could actually act as an agent of the company. So he's an agent of the company because him being an administrator, or maybe if certain roles have been given to him by the board of directors as administrator, then of course he could actually enter into transactions that could actually make the company become liable. You know, in the scenario whereby we have an agent, there's usually the principal. There's usually the principal, then we have the agent. So in this case, the company secretary is like the agent, and the company itself becomes the principal. So certain acts of the company secretary can actually make the company as the principal become liable. For example, he could enter into certain transactions that can actually make the company become liable. So since he can actually play an administrative role in the company, if that particular role is given by the board of directors, then of course he could enter into certain transactions that can actually make the company become liable. So he can actually act as an agent of the company. So he can actually act as an agent of the company. For example, I'm giving you, for example, if he has an administrative role in the company that is given by the board of directors, then in such a case, he could actually maybe buy furniture on behalf of the company. So that is a transaction he's actually carrying out on behalf of the company. He could actually maybe get stationery for the board of directors on their behalf, like maybe pens to use in board meetings, stationery to use in the board meetings. In this case, those particular transactions will likely make this particular company secretary to come out as being an agent of the company, So the company itself becomes the principal and he may actually becomes the agent. So certain transactions of the company secretary can actually make the company become liable. In mostly in a scenario whereby he's actually playing an administrative role as the company secretary. So that's how we can actually be able to view him as actually being an agent of the company. Then an officer of the company. So now these ones basically is where now we find his roles are actually seen as being an official person of the company. So an officer of the company basically means that he's an official person of the company whose roles and mandate are actually already outlined by the Companies Act, or they're actually already outlined under the Act. So he's actually an official person whose roles are already outlined in the Companies Act. So he has his duties that have already actually been set under the Act or under the law. So the secretary is also an officer of the company under the Companies Act, and his roles and mandate will likely be outlined by the Companies Act. So his roles and liabilities in the company can actually be found in the Companies Act. So that's why you see him as an officer of the company. He's an official person of the company whose appointment is actually outlined by the Companies Act, and also his roles and duties are actually set out in the Companies Act. So that's how you can actually be able to view the company secretary under the law. And basically, when we say under the law, for example, there could be an argument in the court of law concerning the company secretary on his roles or duties. So this is how basically a court of law judge can actually be able to interpret his role in the company. So maybe you could look at him having acted as an agent while carrying out his role. You could look at him as actually having acted as an official person or an officer of the company while carrying out his duties or mandate. He could look at him as actually having acted as a servant of the company. And in this case, this particular servantship is actually derived from him being appointed by the board of directors, and the board of directors basically instruct him on what he's actually supposed to do in the company. So this is how basically the legal position, you can see a position basically leads to maybe role in the company, or maybe duties in the company. So how can they actually come out or be outlined or be interpreted under the law? That we are talking about the legal position of the company secretary, the legal position of the company secretary. So I think there's only one thing that is actually remaining. But of course, that one I want us to look at it by being able to look at a past paper question. So that is the end of company secretary. Is the end of this topic. You can look at May 2019, question 7A. 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 They're saying describe 8 particulars of secretaries that are required to be contained in the company's register of secretaries. So they're saying describe 8 particulars of secretaries that are required to be contained in the company's register of secretaries. So register of secretaries is basically just an enlisting of all the secretaries of persons who have actually served as secretaries of the company. So the particulars or the contents of the register of secretaries, because I've just told you the company secretary can actually be can actually maybe be an individual, just an individual or a natural person, or it could be a corporate body. It could be a juristic person or a corporate body or a company. So it could be a natural person and a human being who has been appointed. It could be a corporate body or a company. So basically, when you look at the particulars will actually relate to what will be the particulars when he's just a natural person or an individual. What will be the particulars when he's actually a corporate body, So you can just say this, the particulars of a register of secretaries, the particulars of the register of secretaries. I can see Sumaya Yasha asking, what are charges? I don't know what he has gotten that particular term. That particular term is most dominant in a topic known as debt capital. Charges are basically, when you talk about charges, they are basically those assets you've actually been able to use as a security in maybe acquiring finance or maybe acquiring a loan in the company. So when you talk about a charge, is basically that asset that has actually been used as a security in a company. So for example, if you use land as a security, then that particular land has actually been charged. So it is actually a charge in the company. So those are charges, basically securities that you've actually been able to use as a company to acquire financing. So if the secretary of, this is what you are supposed to write. If the secretary of a public company is a natural person, the company shall ensure that the register of secretaries contains the following particulars. If the secretary of a public company, or just say, if the secretary of a company is a natural person, if the secretary of a company is a natural person, if the secretary of the company is a natural person, the company shall ensure that its register of secretaries contains the following particulars. That its register of secretaries contains the following particulars. Contains the following particulars. A or Roman 1, is it Roman? You can use Roman 1 or a dash, the way you want it. The first one, the name and any former name of the secretary. The name and any former name of the secretary. The name and any former name of the secretary. The name and any former name of the secretary. Then the address of the secretary, that is the next one, the address of the secretary. 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 Then another sentence or paragraph you can write. If the secretary of the company is a company or a firm, if the secretary of the company is a company, if the secretary of the company is a company or a firm, comma, the company shall ensure, if the secretary of the company is a company or a firm, if the secretary of the company is a company or a firm, comma, the company shall ensure that its register of secretaries contains the following particulars. That its register of secretaries contains the following particulars. Contains the following particulars. That its register of secretaries contains the following particulars. So semicolon, so they can put the first one, you can use dash or number 1, the way you want it. So the name of the company or firm, the name of company or firm, the name of the company or firm. Then the next one, the registered or principal office of the company. We've said the first one, the name of the company or firm, the name of the company or firm, the name of the company or firm. Then number 2, the registered or principal office of the company or firm, the registered or principal office of the company or firm, the registered or principal office of the company or firm, the registered or principal office of the company or firm. Then the next one, the legal form of the company or firm and the law by which it is governed. The legal form of the company or firm and the law by which it is governed. The legal form of the company or firm and the law by which it is governed. Then the last one, if it is an incorporated firm, 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 the register in which it is recorded, the register in which it is recorded, the register in which it is recorded, if in case it is actually an incorporated firm, comma, the register in which it is recorded, including the place where it is kept, 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 and its registration number, and its registration number, and its registration number. And its registration number. So they are asked for 8. So some of them you can just split. For example, the first one, the one I'm talking about, in the case of an individual, they're talking about the name and any former name of the secretary. You can put the name of current secretaries. Then number 2, you put the name of former secretaries of the company, the address of the secretaries. There's another one I'm talking about here, the legal form in which it actually operates. So you can say the legal form in which it actually operates as a point. Then you actually also put the law that actually governs the incorporated body or the corporate body serving as a company secretary. So you can split some of them to make 8 marks. So the Roman 2, state 2 grounds for disqualification from being registered as a company secretary. So that one can actually talk about if he has been convicted by a court of law of an offense involving fraud or dishonesty. If it is ascertained by a qualified medical practitioner that he is of unsound mind, he is undischarged bankrupt. So we are saying grounds of disqualification. These ones, we've stated them in the notes. So maybe we can just refer to them. So I see Eunice is asking, Catherine is asking, what do you mean by the law by which it is governed? You know, this particular corporate body, it could be a partnership. It could be a partnership. It could be a company. The law governing companies is the Companies Act. The law governing partnership is the Partnership Act. So you can basically say it is a partnership that is registered and is actually regulated by the Partnership Act. When you talk about a corporate body, it could be a partnership. It could be partners who that firm, how they operate is a partnership, and not maybe it is not like a company. So obviously for companies, they are regulated by the Companies Act. For partnerships, they are regulated by the Partnership Act. So Catherine, you've gotten it. So it could be a partnership. For example, you could join forces with Eunice, then you basically form a partnership. Instead of registering your firm as a company, you want to provide secretarial services, you decide, let us just register a partnership firm. Then you provide those services as a partnership firm. So that particular company you are providing your services will basically indicate in their register that we have a firm known as Eunice and Catherine Partnership. This particular firm is registered under is actually regulated by the Partnership Act. Then I can see Eunice asking, in the case of joint secretaries, where the firm were a legal person, is it sufficient to state particulars? In the case of joint secretaries, where the firm were a legal person, is it sufficient to state the particulars? I don't know what she actually means, but of course, if they're actually joint secretaries, it will clearly indicate in the register all their names, because joint secretaries, we are saying it's more than one. They could be two, they could be three. So you must actually always state all their particulars in that particular register. That we have, for example, Job serving as a company secretary this year. Then also we have another one known as Eunice serving as a company secretary. So all their names will actually appear in the register. So the name of those particular joint secretaries, all their names must actually appear in the register, and their details. So I think today we can end there, but next time before we start the topic of accounts, and I think it's auditors, not accounts. I think the next topic is actually auditors. So it's auditors. Before we start auditors, remind me to look at a few questions on company secretary. I would like us to look at a few questions before we start our next topic. So I think we can just end there today. We can end there today. So you remind me next time. I know there are questions that you'll come across. You can look at maybe I can just highlight this one. May 2016, question 3A. May 2016, question 3A. May 2016, question 3A. Explain the legal position of the company secretary. So that is what we just looked at as the last thing, as a servant of the company, as an agent of the company, as an officer of the company. Then Roman 2, as the company secretary of Jumbo Limited, you have been instructed to prepare an annual return for the company for purposes of filing. Highlight 4 contents that you would include in the above annual return. So that is the return that I was actually talking about. That return you make to the registrar of companies. So part of the contents will actually be, the type of the company and its activities, type of the company and its activities, address of its registered office, 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 particulars of directors and secretaries, particulars of directors and secretaries, particulars of directors and secretaries, names and addresses of the members of the company, names and addresses of the members of the company at the date of return, names and addresses of the members of the company at the date of return, So you've said type of the company as number 1 and its activities, Number 2, address of its registered office, particulars of directors and secretaries, then names and addresses of members of the company at the date of return, number of shares held by each member is another one. This one is May 2016 question 3A. Melda, it's May 2016 question 3A. So number of shares held by each members, number of shares held by each members. So I think I'll organize, or now you guys will likely get the notes. I don't know if I sent I haven't sent those ones for directors. I haven't also sent these ones for secretaries, but I'll organize. I'll send them so they'll be shared with you through Helen, so that you guys can maybe read deeper and understand. But of course, anytime you're in the class, be taking summary notes. You know, the teacher will give summary notes or will just hit the areas he thinks that will actually be tested. So your summary notes could actually be your savior, mostly in the last 30 minutes or 1 hour to the exam. You can peruse through and you'll cover a lot of things before you sit for the exam. So I'll organize how you can actually be able to get the notes. So Teresia really wants me to repeat point 1 and 2. I've said the type of the company and its activities. Then I've said address of its registered office. Then I've said particulars of directors and secretaries. Then I've said names and addresses of those who are members at the date of return. Then I've said number of shares held by each members, number of shares held by each members, and stating, you can maybe amplify it, and stating the shares transfers since the date of last return, number of shares held by each member, and stating the shares transferred since the date of last return, since the date of last return, since the date of last return. You can add another one, amount of indebtedness in respect of all registerable charges, total amount of indebtedness in respect of all registerable charges, amount of total indebtedness in respect of all registerable charges, all registerable charges. Then you can actually also include name of the authorized signatory, names of the authorized signatories of the company, names of the authorized signatories of the company. That is what will be contained in that annual return. You will seek the company secretary to assist you to make to the registrar of companies, to the registrar of companies. So I think we can end there today, unless you have a question or any comment, then you can just do it in the next 1 minute. But you guys can actually have a good afternoon and a lovely Sunday. Until we meet next time, I'll organize if we can also have a class on Thursday from around 7, but I'll communicate. You'll be checking your group. You'll see I'll communicate on Thursday from 7. We are likely to have 7 p.m. We are likely to have a class and revise a bit here. Then we start the next topic of auditors. The next topic of auditors.